Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. Yes, I noticed there's a glare over there. Just time of day and where I'm situated. Hopefully that won't get too distracting. But anyways, new episode, we talk about Spine 7, A Night to Remember, directed by Roy Ward Baker, 1958. It's the Titanic. What else? I seem to be picking all these things that seem to have a lot of discussion already. I guess I'll start off with, this was actually my first Titanic film that I saw. And interestingly enough, it was the same year that another Titanic film was going to come out. And so, there you have it. A lot has been said about the Titanic. A lot has been said about a certain Titanic film. Thank you, Mr. Plinkett, for relieving that pressure off of me. And there's even been a lot that has been said about other Titanic enterprises. And both of them are animated. They come from Italy. Enough said. Alright, actually, I'm not what you would call a Titanic fan, or which is kind of a weird thing to say. But I'm very familiar with the story, and I'm very familiar with what happened. And there is something fascinating about the Titanic in general, which is why, actually, in the history of... There is a long history of depicting the Titanic in film. In fact, it is almost as old as the event itself. The very first Titanic film to have been made was released 29 days after it happened. Obviously, the concept of too soon was not was not a big thing. And ever since then, there have been plenty of times where there has been something with the Titanic that has been depicted in film alone. I'm not going to get into the other things that you can find about the Titanic, including a musical example, Gavin Bryar's minimalist work, The Sinking of the Titanic. In fact, James Cameron was not the first to put a fictionalized love story in the midst of the Titanic. It was as early as 1913. It was a Danish film called Atlantis. It was not directly about the Titanic, but it featured ocean liners, a similar event, and so forth. So I guess it would be best to start off, what makes the Titanic as an event itself so fascinating to depict in film? And this is something that Plinkett sort of touched on in his review of Titanic. But I'm going to put a little slightly different spin on it. The Titanic itself is a very romantic moment. And by romantic, I mean big R romantic. I'm talking about pretty much anything that was written in the 19th century. Wordsworth, both Shelleys, Goethe, particularly Sorrows of Young Werther, and even Faust to a certain sense. Yeah, I guess it's also that too. But it's a very, very big R romantic moment. And what I mean, and especially in talking about man's hubris. Man has had this tendency to think that he is better than nature and maybe even better than God, and does the one thing that will conquer nature, whether it be reanimating dead tissues or whether it's doing that or cheating death or making some work that will stand the test of time. And nature has this way of saying, no. In fact, nature right now is fighting with me in this thing. Okay, there we go. clouds. Clouds, nature's filter, nature's light filter. Anyways, okay, thank you. Thank you for making your point. So yeah, and Titanic is romantic moment bar none. You know, it's an epitome of that. Man decides to make this grand, big ocean liner, and even has the audacity to declare it an unsinkable ship. And when you look at the ship itself, it is a marvel to behold. Not just in terms of size, but just in terms of what it had, what it was capable of doing, and it really was a sight to behold. And then it collided into an iceberg. And it wasn't just the fact that it collided into an iceberg. There was just a lot of little things that just accumulated and added up to this thing. It's not necessarily cause and effect, but it's one of those things where it's those little things that goes to show that maybe we're not as big and superior as we like to think of ourselves to be. So the moment itself is it's a very romantic moment. It's a very humbling moment. It showcases the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. And so it's that kind of thing that lends itself to films. And cinema was born out of the romantic movement, out of that romantic time period. And so there's always going to be this sense of the romantic, even though it's not as prevalent as it was in its beginnings. It certainly is always going to have that air of the romantic. And as long as it has that, subjects like the Titanic are going to be very popular. And it has, and all through the years, there's been some kind of film of the Titanic. And yes, there was James Cameron's. Now, what makes A Night to Remember stand out? Well, for one simple reason. It is perhaps, and I think I can say this with confidence. Again, go to Wikipedia. There's a long list of films that depict the Titanic, but it's the only one, to my knowledge, where it is about the Titanic. It is a dramatized film that it dramatizes the story and nothing else. No additional love story, no additional nationalistic baggage. Yes, even there was even a Nazi propaganda film that involved the Titanic. I mean that. This it's been covered, but this is just about the Titanic. And actually, this was made in reaction to the 1953 film called Titanic, starring Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, Robert Wagner, Audrey Dalton. And while it said it was Titanic and it covers Titanic, it was also kind of fast and loose with things. And it also, I've seen a few stills of it, and it doesn't look all that impressive. Certainly compared to James Cameron's, which, again, it's its own little thing. But the story goes that William McQuitty, who himself survived the Titanic, saw that and was just like, this is not the Titanic. And he wanted to actually wanted to make a film that covered the Titanic, that was just about the Titanic. None of this romantic stuff, none of this extra drama stuff, just about the ship itself, about the people, the key people in it. Gives you a little bit of a sense of what the social dynamics were at the time, and all these things, and depict the sinking, depict the other events that surround the sinking of it. You know, the various ships that miss SOS messages and all that stuff. Just basically cover the event. Just do it without going into excess drama. And just cover the event. Because let's face it, the event itself is already quite dramatic, and you don't need to add additional stuff. If plenty of people have said this, Nostalgia Critic has said this, Plinkett has said this. Why do you need to have another villain? Why do you need to have a villain in a Titanic film? Isn't the iceberg supposed to be the villain? Well, here, if you wanted to see a film where you just want the iceberg as the villain, there you go. Watch A Night to Remember. A Night to Remember is still held up as the most as the more authentic of the Titanic depictions. It's not without its share of liberties. Probably the big egregious one. I can't understand for the life of me why this is the case. But when the Titanic noticed the iceberg and was trying to steer around it, it steered to port. But in A Night to Remember, it steered to starboard. And I'm not sure why that was the case. And in fact, I bought this specifically for the Centennial. I bought it that weekend. And I actually watched it on the day with a good friend of mine, Cody Burkett. And that was actually one of the things that I noticed right off the bat was when it steers. Like, wait a minute, weren't they supposed to steer port instead of starboard? But I don't know why that was there. So there are other little minor things. Yes, there was the whole issue of the ship. This is one of those depictions where it was assumed that the ship was sunk whole, that it didn't split in any way. But this was based on eyewitness accounts which were not entirely reliable, and that could be forgiven. But a lot of the other things were documented or at the very least very, very plausible. And any kind of dramatic or artistic liberties were very few. And if you want to know what those are, you can look at those and compare those. But basically, if you want a dramatized film that just focuses on the event itself without any kind of emotional or additional dramatic baggage, this is the film to watch. And now, it's probably one of those films that, unless you want to go out of your way to to see every Titanic film that was ever made, the reason why I purchased this is because it was to mark the Centennial. It was my way of marking the Centennial. And by the way, for me personally, it was interesting. I have to note this. On the Centennial itself, actually, Pascha was celebrated. It was the same day as Pascha. Pascha is the Orthodox term for Easter. Pascha that year fell on the Titanic Centennial. And I find that very, very befitting in a way to the most important feast for the Orthodox Church, celebrating Christ's resurrection, his victory over death. And I would say that even applies to Titanic. So I think that's quite befitting. I've noticed other little coincidences involving Pascha and then afterwards Bright Week, where certain anniversaries of very morbid things. For instance, in 2011, the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl happened on Bright Tuesday. And also last year, the 5th anniversary of the Virginia Tech shooting happened on Bright Tuesday. So I take that as a sign that you can look at those anniversaries either as a very morbid, morose thing of people dying and incompetence and evil and so forth, or it's to show that, you know what, the resurrection is promised to them too. So that's kind of how I take it. So sorry for that little religious aside, but at any rate, so I would say that if you definitely want to see just the Titanic and not get into any love stories, not getting into any additional nonsense, and certainly major nonsense. I'm talking about the animated films now. If you want to avoid all of that, it's a great film to watch for that. If you just want the Titanic, pure and simple, no excess, it's a great one to view. and that's really all you can really say about it. I mean, it's very straightforward. It was certainly well made at the time. It was it did anticipate. I would say that it did anticipate a lot of what James Cameron would do. Of course, James Cameron, when he made Titanic, he had certainly more tools available to him, and then there were some additional tools that were coming his way that he was able to utilize. So it definitely added to the realism and the spectacle, and so it's not to take away. It's certainly not to take away anything that he did with that, but I just can't get over just how simplistic the story and the characters are. I mean, it definitely reads like a lot of the early films of the 1910s and the 1920s. I'm talking about D.W. Griffith. Just very, like a very simple story, flat characters, not a lot of dimension. So I think that's my big beef. And yes, I did see Titanic in the theater. This is what you get when you visit a lot of female cousins around the holidays. So that's what I did. I only saw it once. I didn't see the 3D reissue that came out last year. Really, I think it's one of those films you just kind of need. You just only need to see once, and then that's it. I know that there have been people who swear by it, who love it, and that's fine. And I want to say this right off the bat. Everything I'm talking about, or I should say most of what I'm talking about, comes down to a personal emotional experience. These films that I've talked about and will talk about down the line, these are just, what it comes down to are just my impressions or my reactions. And it comes from a certain history, a certain set of predilections, and so on. And I just simply react that I either like something or I don't. And I'm not trying to persuade you to change your mind about something. Your experiences are your own. If you absolutely love Titanic 1997, that's fine. I don't. I like A Night to Remember a bit more, as far as Titanic films are concerned. And I'm not trying to take away from it. I'm just basically sharing my own thoughts, ideas, and I'm not trying to persuade really anybody. I just want to share with you, and you can take it for whatever it's worth to you. Take it as maybe a little bit informative, maybe a little bit insightful, just a slightly different take on it. There's only so many takes you can take of anything, I guess. but just take that for whatever it's worth. So these are just my opinions and just my impressions and nothing more. And I'm not trying to dissuade you from yours, and I don't expect you to dissuade me from mine. So, at any rate, yeah, I mean, what else can you say about A Night to Remember? As you may have seen, this is another case where this is a reissue. This was reissued in 2012. Yes, partly to take advantage of the centennial, but I think also to take advantage of a better restoration and new features and so forth. The initial 1998 DVD release was also fairly somewhat bare bones. I believe there was a commentary track on that one too, but this one has a lot more stuff and everything, and yes, it was released in the centennial. I will say this one little thing. Criterion did, they still do this. On their newer releases, they have these short little videos. You see them on YouTube. The 3 reasons, and they did one for A Night to Remember, and for the 3rd reason, they said that it's. I think the words were like the best Titanic film ever made, which I look at that and I reinterpret it in my mind as "Eat it, James Cameron." So there you go. So again, like, I know this kind of invalidates ways. Well, what do you say about personal experience? Well, again, this is my interpretation. So I would say that if you want a film that says "Eat it, James Cameron," there you go. but seriously, it's it's definitely a film worth checking out, seeing, because it's about the Titanic, and it's only about the Titanic, and I'm just repeating myself at this point. So, there you go. A night to remember, and boy, was it a night to remember. So, until next time, take care.